Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We're gonna do understanding the social war, which is around the Italian allies and Rome. Wondering if it's due to representation or citizenship or encroachment. We'll figure that out along the way. New channel, Tribute, I believe that's what it's called, or Tribune. Um, let's talk about it just because this is kind of like entangled within the solid conversation that we've started and the twilight of the Roman Republic. Let's go.
Hannibal is regarded, not without reason, as one of the giants of military history. The crafty Carthaginian was a true innovator whose use of deception, tactical flexibility, and psychological warfare was all well ahead of his time. In fact, Hannibal would only be defeated when a Roman commander of his caliber adopted many of the Carthaginians' innovations and applied them to the superior Roman war machine. But if Hannibal was so capable, it becomes natural to ask why, despite a decade of military dominance in Rome's Italian heartland, he was unable to defeat the Republic. Knowing that Rome would always have a manpower advantage, Hannibal had sought to deprive Rome of the Italian allies that formed half of its legions.
I like how this is set up. We're talking about 100 so years prior, but it begs the question of Italian allies versus Rome.
He knew his enemy well, and knew just how exploitative the relationship was between Rome and its allies, causing him to believe that he would be greeted as a liberator across Italy.
Hmm.
But, by and large, the Italians were unwilling to throw off the Roman yoke.
Well, the Roman yoke also not invaded, but they would reoccupy territory and harshly penalize cities and individuals who defected, basically.
At least, not yet. Here, as in so many other areas, Hannibal was simply too far ahead of his own time. The Italians would eventually revolt nearly a century after Hannibal's death, but it was not an uprising that any of them seemed to have wanted. Rather than resorting to violence, they had hoped to gain Roman civic rights and protections through conventional means, by repeatedly displaying their loyalty to Rome and by bravely serving alongside the legions. But centuries of faithful submission had brought many Italians no closer to true citizenship, something they had been actively campaigning for since at least the tragic tribunates of Gaius Gracchus and Fulvius Flaccus. The Roman populace had been dissuaded from extending citizenship when fear-mongering traditionalists told them it would mean an influx of Italian migrants that
And of course, one thing you just mentioned there was the Gracchus, and we've seen the Gracchus brothers, the Gracchi, and all that extra history. Great series. Go watch it if you haven't yet. But really talking about the reforms and reinstitutionalizing the whole nature of what is a Roman and what is the Italian peninsula look like when we incorporate people into becoming citizens and so forth. But yeah, it's been a struggle for. I mean, if we talk about like real, like we're looking at 400-ish years of this power of Rome, this hegemonic power that has come to be, really encroach and almost extort, but not yet, but more or less just hold a umbrella over the entire peninsula and create this classist society of what is a citizen and what is not.
would take all the best seats in the theaters and at the games. Nativism, then as now, proved to be a useful screen for
Nativism's a better word than classism.
masking selfishness, perpetuating exploitation, and denying rights. For it should be obvious that Italians were after more than admission to the gladiatorial games.
Yeah.
To them, citizenship would have represented full inclusion in the community to which they were already subject.
In any democratic processes.
They were bound by Roman law, but not protected by it. This was understandably intolerable in a civic culture that placed such an emphasis on libertas. Though the right to vote in Roman assemblies was certainly coveted, it must be noted that the franchise was likely not the most desired aspect of citizenship. Instead, Italians would have sought the protection of the law from capricious punishments and confiscation of property. They did not want to see their land allotted to Roman citizens with no recourse. or their sons marched off to a war for which they had no say.
Hmm.
The Italians were always told that now is not the time, to keep waiting for the opportune moment, but were starting to run out of patience, and each betrayal stung all the more. Despite their loyalty, dysfunctional Roman politics had utterly failed them. After centuries under the Roman boot, and with the indignity of their second-class status becoming more of a burden as Italians were dispatched for long-term military service across the Mediterranean world on Rome's behalf, the Italians realized that the Republic built on armed expansion, exploitation, and coercion would only ever respect force. The question then is not why the Italians rebelled, but
It's when.
rather what took them so long. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing.
Yeah, go subscribe to them. Tribunate. That's what it's called. First video ever doing with them. I'm sure we'll do more in the future.
We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm.
They only had 619 at this time? Oh. 51,000. So, doing good, doing good. Good job, Tribunate.
To notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by
Wow.
becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. We are told by Appian that they could not bear to be considered subjects instead of equals, and with the murder of the tribune Drusus, their most stalwart ally in 91 BCE, the communities of Italy understood that politics offered no hope of liberation. They were putting down their plowshares and taking up swords. When the Italians learned of the murder of Drusus and of the reasons alleged for banishing the others, they considered it no longer tolerable that those who were laboring for their political advancement should suffer such outrages, and, as they saw no other means of acquiring citizenship, they decided to revolt from the Romans altogether,
Okay.
and to make war against them with might and main. They sent envoys secretly to each other, and formed a league, and exchanged hostages.
Okay, so Appian. Okay. So, this is like 200 years later.
As a pledge of good faith. Like a
Right.
wildfire, rebellion spread across Italy, evidence that some degree of prior coordination had taken place. Perhaps the conspiracy even dated back to 95 and the expulsion of all Italians from Rome. An event that we are told irked the Italian nobility in particular. In solidifying Roman rule, the Republic had always been careful to win over local elites. But in recent years, Roman arrogance had led to shocking incidents that saw the wealthy and distinguished members of these allied communities subject to the same arbitrary punishments and indignities as the common man.
Oh, is that like when we were talking about the equestrians and like the quaestors and like how equestrians could be seated so quaestors could not get away with crime? Is that it?
We are told by Gracchus of a particularly harrowing incident where an Italian dignitary was publicly stripped and beaten for not clearing the town's baths quickly enough so that a magistrate's wife could enjoy them in private. The offending Roman may have forgotten this abuse by the end of the day, but we can be sure that the humiliated Italian and his community would have held this slight close and let it fester into hatred.
Well, yeah. Even if this is like an anecdotal like fiction or it's nonfiction, who knows? Any incident of that nature would leave a grudge.
The message seemed clear. Even the noblest Italian was but a servant of the Republic, and he had no right to question its policies or his status within this arrangement. It is little wonder that so many found this intolerable, especially as the distinctions between the Italian nobility and their Roman counterparts were slowly being erased. However, even as the Italians rose in revolt, they did not shake off the Republic entirely. The rebels organized into a confederation that consciously mirrored Roman political institutions, selecting a senate of 500 leading men and naming 2 consuls and 12 praetors that would lead the war effort. Ironically, they were emulating the very political structure that had failed them. The long smoldering fires of an Italian war were now fanned into flame. All Italy took up arms against the Romans. The rebellion began with the people of Asculum,
Okay.
who had put to death the praetor Servilius and Fontius,
Wow.
his deputy. It was then taken up by the Marsi, and from them it made its ways into all the districts of Italy. The fortune of the Italians was as cruel as their cause was just, for they were seeking citizenship in the state whose power they were defending by their arms. Every year, and in every war, they were furnishing a double number of men, both of cavalry and of infantry, and yet were not admitted to the rights of citizens in the state, which, through their efforts, had reached so high a position that it could look down upon men of the same race and blood as foreigners and aliens.
And good for them. Good for them. No people should be, you know, put in a position to where they give their lives, their brethren, and so much, and for what in return? No citizenship? Come on. But this is the nature of the idea of a state and an empire is ever so evolving at this point. City states and kingdoms or peoples. It's the intertangling of politics. It's kindling. It's kindling. But you have to have revolts to get stuff done sometimes. Sometimes.
The high degree of coordination and planning that would have been required to swiftly put this governmental structure in place and select Corfinium as the capital for this alliance again points to a long brewing plot against Rome, and not a mere escalation after the death of Drusus. The reformist tribune's assassination may have been the straw which finally broke the camel's back, but the Italians were clearly planning something.
And we see that all the time, like an isolated incident just puts something over the top.
A fact which Drusus himself alluded to when he disclosed an apparent plot to assassinate the consuls. But, though a desire for citizenship is often presented as the chief cause of the social war, it is hard to imagine that the Italians would mobilize to this degree simply for citizenship alone, and it seems likely that some communities, particularly the Marsi and the Samnites, seemed set on full independence.
That's what I was thinking about at the top.
We are unfortunately limited in what we can know about the Italian motivations for the uprising, as our primary source is Appian, a
Which is like 200 years later.
Greek with Roman citizenship, writing over 100 years after the conflict. Appian presents citizenship as the central focus, and indeed it may initially have been for many of the communities. But we err in thinking that because the Italians had a common enemy, that they must have had a common cause.
And I mean, within any war, there's like variables like why did World War One start? Why did World War Two start? So like I think it's in that degree, but there's a foundation, like there's pillars to it for sure. I'm sure citizenship and encroachment and representation are the forefront.
Even though Rome was slowly knitting the peninsula together, the communities were still remarkably diverse, and many had their own local languages, customs, and religious traditions that marked them as separate not just from Rome, but from their Italian confederates. As later events would indicate, some of the Italians, even at this early stage, desired not to become Roman, but to fully sever their bonds with the Republic.
Makes sense.
But whatever the causes of the revolt, the inescapable truth is that this was the most devastating war Rome had seen in generations, and we are told that 300,000 deaths occurred as a result of the conflict.
Civil wars do that.
An exaggeration, perhaps, but
Yeah.
one that is indicative of the bitterness and tenacity of the struggle. Civil wars are always fought with a particular savagery, and the relatively short social war would still prove even more devastating than the decades-long war with Hannibal.
Hard to imagine that being the case, especially when you lose like 80,000 Kanai. I mean, you lose a decent amount of people as well throughout the rest of the Punic War, but If 300,000 is inflated, it could be similar, but still, short period of time, hatred is just probably, yeah, the catalyst to all this. Is crazy. Always interesting looking at these paintings.
The last time an enemy had been able to penetrate Italy. The fighting was tough, in part because the Italian rebels were equipped in a manner more or less equivalent to the Roman legions, and led by commanders that were well versed in Roman strategies and tactics. This led to a string of initial victories for the Italians, and indeed, the Romans soon found themselves on the back foot, with Consul Lucius Julius Caesar forced to offer civic concessions to those allies who had
Which is not the Julius Caesar, obviously.
not yet rebelled, in order to keep them in the fold. The narration of military movements and troop deployments has never been this channel's strong suit, and I will mostly avoid it here, except to say that the only Roman commanders of note to enjoy real and sustained success against the Italians were Marius to the north of the city,
And then there's Sulla to the right.
and Sulla in the south. The two leading men of the Republic had put aside their fierce rivalry due to the outbreak of the war, and would break with one another before it entirely concluded. But for now, they were on the same side. A testimony to the fact that Romans of all political stripes were united in believing that the Republic had the authority to dominate its allies and subjects, and the alliance is indicative of why the Italians had been driven to such desperation in the first place. The Italian peninsula may not have been united, but Rome was, and despite the early Italian victories, the sheer inertia of the unyielding Roman war machine, as well as its superior logistical and military resources.
And you're obviously one thing, if you say Rome is like unified in this fight, I don't know if I could say the same thing for the Italian allies, because there's probably like a split between conservative Romanized people, and then you have the more radical, independent driven people. And you're gonna have people that kind of flip flop probably too.
Eventually shifted the momentum decisively in the Republic's favor. But despite a willingness to pretend otherwise, military success is not what broke the heart of the revolt. Instead, the end of the war was accelerated through the intensely un-Roman act of compromise, chiefly a law passed in 89 which offered citizenship to any rebels who ceased hostilities within 60 days, and reaffirmed their allegiance to the Republic.
He said compromise, which makes sense, but I think there was some momentum towards the citizenship. What it looks like there was momentum going that way either way. This accelerated it.
This gradually weakened support for the rebellion.
Yes.
But the conflict persisted until 87, as certain communities, such as the Samnites, relished their newfound independence.
Yeah, some people wanted it more for independence, which variables across the field,
and decided to seek liberty or death. The Republic was only too happy to oblige. The eradication of these isolated holdouts allowed for Rome to save face and declare victory in a war that had largely not been won by the might of the legions, but rather by acceding to the demands of its foes. It is for this reason that the social war is often called the unnecessary war, as historians bemoan that it could have been avoided by granting the citizenship rights and protections to which the Italians were certainly entitled.
Yeah.
There is merit to this view, but I also believe that speaking of the social war as unnecessary is only possible when one buys into the framing of the Republic and its leaders as the narrators of history, as the only ones with an agenda, and the only actors with a right to forge their own destiny. It also elides the stubbornness of the Roman aristocrats by presenting it as a regrettable, short-sighted lapse in judgment, a mistake that was only possible because they were not thinking logically. In reality, however, they were operating in a manner that was consistent with the Roman worldview, that underscored their right to unflinchingly dictate terms to the conquered. It was an application of the Vae Victis ideology that had built the Republic's empire, not a mere accident of bull-headed patricians unable to see the larger picture. This is not to say that they were acting rationally, or that causing the war was not a strategic blunder. But it is to say that they were acting as Romans. Viewing things from this perspective is a reminder that the war was not unnecessary for the Italians. Rather, it is a stinging indictment of their brutal exploitation and centuries of suffering that they elected to rise and defend their own dignity through arms when politics had failed. The men who led the revolt had all served alongside the legions. They knew exactly what Rome did to those it conquered, had seen firsthand the violence and humiliation Rome visited upon its foes. They certainly understood that as traitors and oathbreakers, they could expect far worse than the foreign enemies that they had helped subdue. That so many were willing to risk this underscores the war's necessity for the Italians.
A lot of desperation, it seems like.
Their victory was their vindication. The Roman elite, who had made peaceful change impossible, had made violent change inevitable. And the Republic would be forever altered by the reshaping of the political order that resulted from the Italians winning citizenship through armed force and not peaceful political means. A new precedent had been set. Describing the impact of the war, Appian wrote, "It began unexpectedly, grew rapidly to great proportions, and extinguished the Roman sedition for a long time by a new terror. When it was ended, it also gave rise to new seditions under more powerful leaders, who did not work by introducing new laws, or by the tricks of the demagogue, but by matching whole armies against each other." The most successful Roman general of the war had been Sulla, and he was able to use his victories as a springboard to the consulship. But as his struggle with his political rival Marius resumed, Sulla observed the concessions that the Italians had won through war, and came to believe that swords solved arguments more effectively than speeches. So, when he was politically outmaneuvered by the Marian faction, Sulla decided that he would use the army at his command to march on Rome and settle the issue. If the argument of the rebels in the social war had been that there was no difference between Roman and Italian, then Sulla took this to heart and decided that the legions would prove just as effective at quashing Romans who demanded rights as they had his Italian military foes. Sulla was marching on Rome with an army at his back. The cautionary tale of Coriolanus made real. An era of unprecedented crisis was beginning, and the Republic would not survive.
Dang. Dang, what a video. What a great video. Just, we watch so many videos that are surrounded within battle tactics and movements and how things change. But I really have an appreciative sense to channels that also encapsulate the politics and the mind of these individuals in the contemporary sense as much as we can get through Appian and other forces or other sources. Really, what these people might have been thinking. What were their motives? What were their resolves from after the fact, like after the battles, after the war? Were they satisfied with the compromise? Were they not satisfied? And from there, what happens? What precipitates? And obviously, we have this Marian Sulla like feud that continues to kind of like muster in the background. And then, of course, at the end of this social war, which is around like 87 BC, we start to see the Mithridatic War, which kind of takes a lot of the attention of Rome. But overall, the Italian allies looks like they're kind of settling down, and especially from the compromise itself, minus maybe the Samnites, but I think they were taken care of, which springboards Sulla into a consulship, and rest is history. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Until next time, peace out and bye bye.